Good morning, everyone. For those who do not know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness and Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for almost 25 years, and I was introduced to the practice during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and panic disorder. And my panic disorder had blown up into agoraphobia. I was unable to leave my house. I was on disability from work. And I happened to get paired up with a psychologist who, even back in the late 90s, had been practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation for several decades. And that turned into the beginning of a very unexpected and extraordinarily fruitful journey for me, which continues to this day and is what brings me here. And I'm glad to have you here with me today. Thank you for coming. Today is the next in our ongoing series of Calming Anxiety by Living Mindfully. The last few sessions, we've explored various ways of managing our attention. And I'm going to continue that theme today. And we're going to incorporate some of the other crucial aspects of this practice along with our attention. And you'll see what I mean. Let's jump in. Okay? Let's begin, as we always do, by imagining that we are suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of our heads, as a nice cue to sit up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. If we find that there is some tension already here, that's completely fine. I have found much more success in simply noticing that tension is here rather than trying to force tension away, which of course is just bringing more tension to the tension that's already here. So, not surprising that doesn't really work. I also like to notice what is beneath me, what is holding me up. A chair, a cushion, floor. Notice that there's a sense of support. And I can allow whatever is holding me up to do so. Let's just take a moment to notice this supporting, this grounding beneath us, and this suspension from the ceiling at the top. And whatever else happens to be in between the two for us right now, however it is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And you may notice that your breathing changes when you bring your attention to it. We may think that we need a certain kind of breathing for our meditation, or perhaps we just Notice how difficult it is to bring our attention to our breathing without starting to control and shape it in some way. It's kind of what we do, right? We see something and immediately try to start molding it to our expectation, our desire. Perhaps molding it away from our aversion, our fear. And in this practice, we're here to see the breathing as it is, and to also see those tendencies as they are, if they're here. If they're not here, we don't need to try to generate them in order to see them. But if they are here, we're here to notice them. We don't even have to interfere with them. If we notice some controlling of the breathing coming up, that can be okay. We just want to see that it's happening. We don't need to fall into the trap of trying to control the controlling, which is like trying to get rid of tension by bringing more tension to force it away. So we can notice the breathing as it is. Controlled, uncontrolled. Long, short, deep, shallow. Pleasant, unpleasant. Neither. The point is the noticing, the seeing, the directed attention. I read something interesting a couple of years ago. From a Buddhist teacher who made an interesting point. Saying that when we're watching the breathing, practicing this breath meditation, technically, we're not really watching the breathing. We're watching the areas where we're able to perceive a change. So if we're watching the breathing by observing the stomach expand and compress. Well, that's not really breathing meditation, it's watching the stomach meditation. Or perhaps we're watching the chest meditation. Or we feel the passage of air through our nostrils or in the back of our throat. Oh, okay. Nostril meditation. Throat meditation. How do we know that the breathing is happening without that kind of sensation? Our perception of it. So it's an interesting thought. Can we actually perceive the breath directly? Or are we relying on other things? To then make an assessment, a discernment, a determination. Oh, breathing's happening. There's breathing. There's the passage of air in and out. And what's interesting is we have so many options, like the ones I just listed, and more, to make that determination. So many different places and different ways that we could feel sensation, to perceive that there is breathing. Let's sit with that for a moment. How are we perceiving that there is breathing? How are we perceiving that breathing is controlled or uncontrolled? Long or short? Pleasant or unpleasant? Or neither? Notice where you're directing your attention. Or perhaps notice if your attention has gotten redirected and you didn't realize it. You may notice how the breathing may feel different depending on where you're directing your attention. Perhaps the experience of the breathing changes when we use one reference point versus another. Perhaps the breathing itself changes when we use one reference point versus another. This is part of that engagement with inquiry and experimentation that's so important in this practice. We're here to observe. We're here to learn. We're here to become more skillful. And how are we going to find out what is more skillful unless we inquire and experiment, observe and learn? This is one of those practices that isn't just about the breathing. We can practice it with the breathing. But one of the reasons we practice it with the breathing and improve the skill of doing it with the breathing is because it can then apply to so much else. When we begin to see how our experience of the breathing can be different depending upon our reference point, our perception based on that reference point, we start to really see, not at an intellectual level, at a felt level, we start to really see, understand, feel how so much of our internal and external lives, what we perceive to be reality, is dependent upon where we're focusing our attention. Dependent upon our sensations and our perceptions of those sensations. And we start to see, so I can adjust my attention. I can work with my perception based on my reference point. and make a change to my experience. Make a change to what becomes my reality. This is karma in the Buddha's teaching. This is karma. The 3 pillars of karma: intention, attention, perception. So if we can form an intention to more skillfully use our attention and our perception, we change our karmic experience. And isn't that why we're here? So we can do that just with the breathing. We can inquire, where am I directing my attention? Upon what reference point am I basing my perception? What happens if I experiment with that? What can I see? What can I observe? What can I learn? What works? What doesn't work? What feels more pleasant, less pleasant? And then as you go through your day, you may take that kind of inquiry and experimentation, that kind of perception work, attention work, and have the intention to apply it to other situations. How are my attention and perception forming what I consider to be reality? And how do I know that's actually reality when there are so many other places and ways that I could be directing my attention, other reference points that I could be using upon which to base my perception. That perhaps lead to different conclusions. And which ones seem to be the most skillful? Which ones cause more suffering? Which ones ease suffering? And when we use our intention and our attention and our perception all working together in this way, starting just with the breathing. We build our karmic path. Thank you, everyone. I will hang on for a few moments if anyone would like to share any questions or observations in the chat. From Chris, assessing breathing like that is overthinking it. I just let it be. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? So you've been with me for a while, so you know that I typically teach uncontrolled breathing. I do typically work with and teach working with simply observing the breathing as it is, letting it be, so to speak, not trying to make it a certain way. In this case, we're not really not letting it be. We're seeing how it is from different vantage points. Because when we're letting it be, but simply looking at it from one vantage point, are we getting the whole picture? Maybe we feel like we're getting enough of the picture. Okay. So just stay there. But it's very interesting and instructive, and oftentimes, in my experience, surprising when we let the same thing just be, but look at it from a different spot. So one of the examples or metaphors that I give a lot is that of surfing. If we're feeling very anxious, sometimes it feels like we're in these whitewater rapids without a boat, going down for the third time, that kind of a thing. And one of the practices I sometimes go through is this one where we start to, we stop fighting against the whitewater rapids, because that's actually why we keep going down and drowning. And we let it be, so to speak. Instead of fighting the rapids, we go with the rapids. And once we stop fighting, the rapids start to lift us. Instead of us going down as we're fighting it, they lift us up because of their momentum. And we start to kind of surf. Are we in control of them? No. Is it pleasant? Not really. Still kind of out of control, but at least we're not drowning. So we're letting it be. but our vantage point has changed based on how we are relating to it being. And then at some point we gain enough balance that we can jump off onto a riverbank and then maybe even climb up onto a cliff and look down at the rapids below. And they're still rapids. They're still loud. They're still wild. We can still feel them. And we're letting them be. But our vantage point has drastically changed. And our perception of them as such has drastically changed. And the amount of suffering that we are experiencing as a result has drastically changed. Still letting it be. But from where? And in some ways, this can be even more pertinent at an external level, because when we're dealing with the external world, and there are so many ways to perceive people's actions and so forth. And then we sometimes have to decide how we're going to act based on our perceptions, which are based on where we're placing our attention and our frame of reference. Oh, if we're only ever using one, and we're only ever seeing one small part of each picture, and then we're trying to base our actions, our speech, our decisions, our thoughts on that, is that skillful? Or do we need to, I don't know, maybe try some different reference points? Try placing our attention in different places, see how it affects our perception, see what other information we get. So it's kind of like the Buddha's middle path. Yeah, some things we let be, but this isn't a passive practice. This is an active practice. So even when we're letting be, we're still actively observing and sometimes experimenting. So there's a middle path there. There's a give and take. And how much we are letting be versus how much we are not letting be, perhaps, will change. And some of the skillfulness that we are learning is that exact balance. How to negotiate that exact balance. I hope that clarifies a little bit. Oh, cheers, Chris. I'm glad that landed. Yeah, like Becky says here, yeah. That was so interesting. I woke up this morning with shortness of breath. Changing my attention from my chest to my belly was such a relief. Less suffering, different perception. That's exactly it. Kind of a much shorter way of everything I just said. I probably should have just read that first. That's exactly it. It's a different vantage point. And the different vantage point might change the breathing itself. It might not change the breathing. But in either case, it changes the perception. And that gets, again, into this very interrelated nature, like with intention, attention, and perception. These all work together. And that's the same thing here, where, okay, I've changed my reference point, and perhaps that didn't directly change the breathing, but perhaps because the changing of the reference point changed my perception of the breathing, that led to a changing of the breathing. To take Becky's example, I'm not saying this is what happened with you, but this is a good starting point. Perhaps, and Becky's saying exactly, so this does seem to resonate. So perhaps by changing the reference point from the chest to the belly, maybe that didn't change the breathing itself right away, but if the perception was, oh, wait a minute, this feels better. This doesn't feel so, whether constricted, short, urgent, whatever it is. This feels better. And as a result of that perception of feeling better, the stress level drops a little bit. And if the stress level drops a little bit, then that's sending a message to the body that, oh, there's no emergency here. And so what happens? The breathing changes. So there was an intention to shift attention from the chest to the belly, which led to a change in perception about the breathing that then acted as a cue to the body that things were okay, and the breathing itself changed. That's a perfect encapsulation of today's practice. Just at that micro level, because it doesn't get much smaller than that, right? Shifted attention from here to here, and oh, look what happened. Breathing changed. And suffering decreased. That's a karmic experience right there. Inquiry, experimentation, cause and effect. And it's no different whether it's at that tiny micro level with a single breath, or, I mean, you could scale that out to anything internally or externally. And that's the point here. That's the point here. What we're doing in this practice right here generalizes. This is practice for off the cushion. This is how we change our karmic experience, our whole lives. And it doesn't seem possible. It sounds ridiculous on paper. But this is how it works. It's certainly how it works in my experience. I'm glad that landed for you. Yeah. Judy, I'm glad this was helpful for you. Notice my mind returned to a painful experience with a friend. I was able to shift my perception to a different thought about that experience and shift my belief about what it means. Exactly. It's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. I'll give a classic example. One of my favorites. I had a client once who told me that he had started a particular job somewhere and thought that there was one of his new coworkers was unfriendly. And I'm going to guess, I don't know how many people here are familiar with the term resting bitch face, which I'm perfectly comfortable using because I often tell people I have resting asshole face. So, turned out this person's face just had the look of, being and having like a scowl. Which again, if I completely relax my face, I don't look particularly pleasant. If you see me not smiling, you're like, what's with this guy? I look like a criminal, serious. It's, but that he came to real, after like 2 years of this, he actually ended up having to interact with this person. And she turned out to be like the greatest person. Like totally, wicked pleasant, which, I would like to think that when people get past my resting asshole phase, they realize, oh, okay, he just looks like an asshole. He's not actually, or maybe they do think, I don't know. It's up to each individual person whether but again, that's another example of perception, right? So that's, again, there's a perception based on where we're directing our attention, and we're creating a reality based upon that. And that's on us. I mean, if we are then basing our thoughts, speech, and actions based upon that, because perhaps he acted in an unfriendly way towards her, thinking that she was being unfriendly towards him. And then because he's acting unfriendly towards her, she could end up acting unfriendly back. And then he's created this reality, right? And it didn't end up happening that way, but it could have. And he's created this animosity that was never there in the first place, simply because he was experiencing a certain perception based on where he was directing his attention. Again, another very simple example of how we create our karmic experience and how we may limit our karmic experience or increase our suffering instead of decreasing our suffering simply based on not engaging in a little bit of inquiry and experimentation. Oh, wait a minute. Is there another place where I can direct my attention? Is there another frame of reference? Is there possibly another explanation? Is there another way this could be perceived? And can I have the intention to work with my attention and perception so I get a bigger picture, clearer seeing, a better foundation upon which to base my own thought, speech, and actions? Because that's what creates my karmic experience. So do I want to base it on a little piece of the picture and hope that that's accurate? Or widen my view a little bit? Say, well, wait a minute, what else is here? Let's see what makes the most sense. Let's gather some more data first. Gagan, did you take medication prescribed by your therapist? Not right away. So I started off seeing a psychologist, and this kind of gets off the path a little bit, so I'll speak briefly about it. I'm always happy to talk more about it elsewhere. It's just a little off the subject for today. But I started off seeing a psychologist and was working with the practice for, about a year or so. And it was really interesting, actually. So I got to the point where I was able to live again. I was out of the house, I was working, I was being social and so forth. What I found in my experience was after about a year, it was funny, I ended up catching the flu. And it was the first time I ever had the flu in my life. I was laid up for like 3 weeks. And I had a lot of time to think about how far I had come, where I wanted to go, and so with the practice and such. And what I found at the time was I had made huge inroads at a psychological level, of course, with the panic and the anxiety and the depression and so forth. Like I said, I was working again and the whole bit. What I found was there was still this physical, there was like this inner shaking that I was still experiencing. So even if I was psychologically relaxed, if you will, there was always this, it was like there was just like in my core, like there was this shakiness. And that I hadn't managed to affect yet. And I frankly wasn't sure, if I was going to be able to do so. And for the amount of work that I was putting in, I said, and part of my problem was I was terrified of psychiatric medication. Because I was like, well, what if I don't like the way it feels? And that starts the whole panic thing and everything. Because once it gets into your system, it takes a while to get in and it takes a while to get out. And so I was terrified of psychiatric medication. So I had these few weeks to kind of think about it. And I was like, it might be time to give that a shot because I've had so much success at a psychological level. But there's still this shakiness that I just can't seem to reduce. This physical shakiness. And I was like, all right, so let me give this a shot. And started seeing a psychiatrist, and he started me out on this very small dose of Prozac and confused the hell out of me. I was like, Prozac, isn't that for depression? He's like, well, it's also for anxiety. I'm like, oh, okay. And so he started me out on this really small dose of Prozac. And I still remember 6 days after I started it, I started it on Monday, and that Sunday, the following Sunday, I remember I woke up and it was just like my entire body had like caught up to the work that I had done, the success I had had psychologically. So suddenly the shakiness had just like, boom, it was just like gone. I was like, holy shit. Like, wow. Okay. Interesting. And I'm not a biologist or a neuroscientist or anything like that, but I've always kind of attributed it to, we can talk about the neurotransmitters and the chemical imbalances and what have you, something along those lines. I know there's tons and tons of theories about that, pro and con. I'm not, making an argument one way or the other. It's just the way I've always thought about it, it kind of made sense to me. So the answer is yes. And it is one of the, as I often like to say, I have a lot of tools in my toolbox, of which mindfulness and insight meditation are the central pillar. But it's not my only tool. There's meditation, there's medication, there's exercise, there's community. There are so many different ways to work with. And again, this kind of, in a way, I can tie this back to what we were talking about, in that we're placing our attention in different places. It's kind of similar. It's like dealing with a crippling panic disorder and agoraphobia and clinical anxiety and depression. I mean, these things, you don't just take one tool. You don't just direct your attention in one place and say, okay, I'm going to fix it all with this. Direct our attention in different places. Say, what if I try this? What if I try this? What if I try this? That inquiry, that experimentation, and we find what works. We find a combination that works. And is that same combination always work? Probably not. You probably have to make some adjustments. So it's an ongoing inquiry and experimentation and adjusting our attention, assessing our perception for accuracy. And sometimes there's this feeling or message in spiritual circles that, oh, well, you shouldn't use medication. I mean, you just, meditate more. Okay. No, it's a right tool for the job. And in my experience, it's, the synergy, if you will, of using multiple tools together. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts and so forth. It's an ongoing inquiry and experimentation. So I think I'll wrap it up there. I hope to see you all again real soon. Have a great rest of your day. And, keep an eye on your intention and your attention and your perception, and see what you find. See what your inquiry and experimentation open up for you. Thanks so much, everyone. Great to see you all. See you again soon. Cheers.